I'll have to trim the beginning of this. All right. So, welcome everybody to Noetic, the humanities teaching app that you can download for your iPhone and Android devices. Tonight I am joined by CJ Eller and Jordan Cline. Jordan, Cline, and CJ have been choosing pieces of literature that we discuss in alteration each week. This week it was Jordan's selection. And Jordan, why don't you tell us about this selection that you made?
This was actually kind of a sort of a by chance kind of selection. I first read of Anais Nin in Glamour magazine. So shout out to Glamour magazine and the Woman of the Year issue.
Why did they make such a big to-do about Anais Nin in Glamour magazine? Why did it captivate you?
I think in the context of it was a photographer writing about her, and I don't know, it's just they just kind of rattled off the people that she associated with, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, who is this lady? Yeah. And then I looked her up and I was like, man, like, we should do something with her. She's really cool. So, yeah, that's my sort of a very non-intellectual story of how I found her. So, yeah, that's that.
So we should say something about the text that we're working off of tonight. And I would like to survey both CJ and Jordan on their particular feelings of the matter. We are working off of a collation of her diaries. We believe it's diaries from the early 30s. So it could be volumes 1, 2, and 3. I think it primarily is volume 1. And this takes place with her sort of encounter with Henry Miller, which we'll discuss a great deal. I want to say a lot more. But maybe before we get into it, I can ask some sort of initial thoughts and feelings about what we covered for tonight. How did this piece of work resonate with you?
Well, for me, it's different from anything we've done, whether it be a short story or a philosophical text, because we're dealing with a diary, something more akin to a memoir, where we are dealing with facts of what happened in somebody's life, but they're more than facts. And we have to try to wrestle out certain meanings that maybe they had and try to wrestle out some universals. In the particular lies the universal, right? Mm-hmm. Or at least that's the impression that maybe we can get from reading one of these things, is that, oh, they had these experiences? Oh, that's similar to me. And maybe we will find some in Anais Nin's diary when we talk about it, but that was at least something to me that was fascinating, was the form that we're dealing with here.
Definitely. I have to say, if anyone really wants some sort of authoritative musings and resources on Anais Nin, there is an entire podcast devoted to her. So we see ourselves merely as people who are popularizing her work. But there's an individual, his name is Paul something or other, and he's written he's written an entire text about Anais Nin. He's sort of devoted his life to covering her authorship. Jordan, would you like to say anything else about this text before we get into it?
Yeah, I would say what I really liked about these diaries is, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of when you get to look at like the sketches of like a really well-known artist, and you're like, oh, this is where they're kind of like working everything out. So in a way, I kind of think of these diaries as a way of her figuring herself out.
And though what's really fascinating is that these works, the diaries, are her best known, if not the best known of all her works. Mm-hmm. So the place where she's working it out is the work, which is an odd thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting posthumously, because there are a lot of artists, right, with their sketches where, I mean, people can't wait to get their hands on them. So it's kind of that same thing where it's like that roughness or that rawness or that like intimacy of without that polish, you know, is like really, really
there's some truth to it, or some reality. It reminds me of a joke, if I can throw in a little funny thing, of there was this one writer who, looking for money, and he was already well established, took his manuscripts for for one of his novels, wrote it out in longhand, and then sold it to the highest bidder as the original manuscript. That there's something about rawness or reality that people are attracted to, whether they throw money or they throw their time and attention. And hopefully we'll get to that kind of thing in this text of what is real, what is the real me, what is the real Anais, what is reality, or what is it we're striving for? So
yeah, I think that'll all become clear if we have a little bit of background information on Anais Nin.
Yeah, give us a rundown.
All right, so she was born in 1903, died in 1977. She was the child of Cuban parents, and she was born in France, where she was raised. Her father abandoned her, and this will become a big theme in her diaries at the age of 10. She began her diaries at the age of 11. She would later say that these were ultimately something that she wanted to communicate something about her experience to her father in this great divorce from him. The diary becomes a bit of her best friend and notable intellectuals that she's surrounded with. Henry Miller, Otto Rank, other psychotherapists try to pry it out of her hands because they think it is some sort of crutch, impediment, obstacle for her true genius coming into being. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, something that's interesting that we need to illuminate for our audience is that there is both the expurgated and the unexpurgated diaries, all right? And what we're dealing with tonight are the expurgated diaries. These are the things that she released and published within her own life. I believe this came out in like 1966 or something like that, and she passed away from cancer in 1977. She was having trouble finding a publisher up until that point. The expurgated diaries are typically more philosophical, more psychoanalytical. They don't reveal sort of the salacious, sensuous details as much. There are allusions to it. All right. And then once she was married to a fellow named Ian Hugo, she just sort of refers to him as Hugo, and he was kind of her financier. He was a banker, and he sort of ended up indirectly sort of supporting all this artistic cabal that she was around. After he passed away, her husband that she was contemporaneously married to, because she was a bigamist, she was married to Hugo and Rupert Pole simultaneously, he felt like it was okay for him to publish the unexpurgated diaries, the unedited diaries, and that came out in 5 volumes. Let me see. And the 5 volumes include Henry and June, Fire, Incest, Nearer the Moon, and Mirages. Now, Henry and June is something that most individuals are probably familiar with. In 1990, the U.S. encountered its first NC-17 movie when this was released. It has Kevin Spacey in it. It has a young Uma Thurman in it. It's quite erotic, and it definitely, the unexpurgated diaries tend to play up all the sexual activity that was going on with this mix of writers and intellectuals. It also should be noticed that Anais Nin, at this particular time of this diary, this expurgated one, she was finishing up her book on D.H. Lawrence, and this was right, and she meets Henry Miller right as he's kind of putting together Tropic of Cancer. But the expurgated and the unexpurgated diaries run parallel to one another, and they sort of emphasize different aspects of the being of Anais Nin in relation to these other individuals. So, saying all of that, I think we need to address the question of why we care. Why do we care? Why are we reading some lady's diary that I didn't even know existed a week ago? Right? Why?
I think it says something about a particular time, and not only that, but a particular lens on that time, which is a woman's view, and not only any woman, but a woman of particular talent and a particular merit. And we're dealing with somebody that is involved with the intellectual scene in France at that time, in the 20th century, which was quite booming with people like Henry Miller.
Who else?
Like people like Antonin Artaud.
We're going to talk a lot about him. Who else?
We're going to talk about
psychoanalyst, famous psychoanalyst.
Otto Rank.
Otto Rank. Yes, he was a disciple of Freud.
Yes.
And she was friends with Gore Vidal, Edmund Wilson, people like that. So this diary gives us an aperture into the personal lives of some of the greatest intellectuals of that time period.
And maybe how she influenced their life.
Oh, yes.
That we keep forgetting that everybody's just a node.
Yeah. It's like a
network.
Symbiotic kind of relationship, and we're seeing the other side of it.
Yeah. Could Henry Miller have written Tropic of Cancer without Anais Nin? Like, how much of it... She was his muse. He was in love with her.
And bankroller.
Yeah, yes, in some ways, yes.
Indirectly, a bankroller.
Yeah,
so there's that.
Yeah, because Henry Miller was begging, and he was very poor in Paris at this particular time. Now he had this wife that had a very unusual relationship with June Miller, which we get some perspective on, and Anais was taking money from the banker husband that she had and helping out Henry when she could. At least that's kind of my understanding. I am no expert on Henry Miller, so their financial situation's a little cloudy for me, but Henry was poor and was dependent upon others, from what I understand. So how much that is dramatized in the movie and the diaries, I'm not certain. I don't know his side of the story.
Right.
So we talked about how it could communicate a universal experience about femininity. This particular woman, she does think that she is writing for herself, but for a lot of other women who are encountering a particular type of struggle. We get this unique glance of how she may have been affected by this intellectual circle that she was running in. And we learn a little bit about the psychoanalytics, the dependency on certain things. But we'll talk about that in a second. So, anything else you want to say there before moving on?
No.
So, how does this diary start off? Jordan, CJ, why don't you walk us through that?
Well, she gives us a rundown of where she's staying when she writes this diary.
Where is she staying?
She's staying in this town of Lucien.
Yeah, Lucien.
What is it?
It's a suburb in Paris.
Right. And how do you recall any of the imagery she describes it as, right? Anything vivid come to mind? She very vividly describes it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she stays in sort of grand old house with these sort of wild, untamed gardens with some woods in the back.
As if it's as if it came from the ground.
Yes, he very dramatically illustrates
Which actually kind of reminded me a little bit of the yellow wallpaper in a way.
Oh, it's a great analogy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I kind of thought of it as almost a foil that she was to Jane. And there's this one quotation.
Please.
Yeah, below the rug I felt was the earth. I could take root here, feel at one with the house and the garden, and take nourishment from them like the plants.
Yes, that's a beautiful passage.
So I think that it's a very intimate account, just even with something as mundane as a house of, there's dirt under this floor. And I'm communing with this house and this dirt.
But she's not just content to be a housewife, is she?
No.
What does she long for?
She wants the sort of surreal. She wants to kind of take those sort of hits on the high of life.
Yeah, she wants these moments where she transcends all the sort of ordinary life and has some sort of an infinite vantage point. I don't really know what she means there, but maybe it'll become more obvious.
I kind of have. I mean, there's also another
what do you think she means?
Quotation. I'll just let her speak for herself.
Sure.
Ordinary life does not interest me. I seek only the high moments. I am in accord with the surrealists, searching for the marvelous.
Yes.
So I think, it's so fascinating because she seems so tortured when she has to go through these mundane things like making coffee or canning fruit or polishing furniture, and she just seems like she just kind of wants to scream from boredom because she's kind of this sort of thrill seeker of the mind.
Yeah, what do you? I mean, this desire for the marvelous. I mean, is it just sort of this ecstasy of being caught up in the moment? Is that? Is that how you guys understand what she's so desirous of? Is that why her writing is so interpenetrated with erotica and lust and color and she'll say elsewhere in the diary that she doesn't crave the absolute, but she craves the relative, which is something I can't understand at all, right? I could live on bread and water. I don't need anything else, really. So this is a text that's hard for me to relate to, being a rather monkish individual in comparison. I don't get the obsession with the sensuous and these dizzying highs and things like that. Now, it's not to say that I don't appreciate her perspective, but is it anything more than that? And I guess the question is there anything more to life than that? Right?
Yeah. I think
is this what makes life worth living?
I mean, I kind of think that sentiment of searching for the marvelous, I think kind of portends the sort of the internet age, right? Of
Please,
constantly I don't know, like, constantly thrill seeking on my, like, Instagram feed. What's Doug the Pug up to? I have to know. Like, cute animals. Oh my gosh, yes. So, I mean, there's kind of that element of, let's go find some thrills on the interwebs.
And how does that, what sort of existential state does that often leave many of us in?
Oh, I mean, it kind of, like, stupefies you, right? And I mean, it kind of leaves you in a sort of a passive kind of state, right? Kind of like I think that you mentioned it earlier, was the sort of the Pascalian notion, right? Of like, we're terrified to be in our room alone.
Right.
With our own thoughts.
Well, we're amusing ourselves to death. Now
exactly.
we can all just sort of get on the internet and find something really stimulating.
We can just find this like awesome gaping maw of just awesomeness that you can just kind of like find those sort of like pleasures in.
That's the interesting question is, does she seem like a happy individual in these diaries? Now, it would seem to me that we kind of all know, because it's so intensified as a result of having the internet and stuff like that, that we all know how much of a letdown that really is. And to me, both the movie and the diary, and not saying they aren't worth reading, but to me, they seem to be profoundly sad for that reason. She seems to me, and obviously I'm bringing certain prejudices to the text, to be imprisoned by her own passions. And so do many of the other characters in this. As brilliant as they are, they seem to be slaves to desire.
Yeah, but I think we need to really take into account, though, the fact that women could explore those facets of themselves. That they could... I think that there's something significant in noting that Anais could even find herself sort of imprisoned to these sort of passions.
It must have felt like liberation.
To being able to explore that is just profound.
Yeah, it must have felt like liberation in comparison to what she was.
Yeah, I mean, think about like what I'm sure her like grandmother would be able to do. You know what I mean? Definitely not a bigamous marriage, that's for sure. You know? Right,
totally.
So I think that we might see that as, oh, how sad, or oh, how vacuous. But I really do think we need to take that sort of like profoundness into consideration.
That's a brilliant point. That's a very point. I want to add something there about Henry Miller, but I think CJ wants to jump in here.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think that goes to your point of it being a foil to the yellow wallpaper.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
right?
Of course.
Yeah. Where
yes.
First we're dealing with a woman that is trapped, and now we are dealing with a woman that is free. Mm-hmm. And of course, that freedom brings about existential woe, but just to be able to have that freedom is maybe the first step.
Yeah.
Right?
And like sort of to your point, CJ, I do have like one passage if I could.
Yes,
read.
please.
It's from
please.
It's from the introduction, and what I have to say is really distinct from the artist and the art. It is the woman who has to speak. It is not only the woman Anais has to speak, but I who have to speak for many women.
Yes.
As I discover myself, I feel I am merely one of many, a symbol. I begin to understand women of yesterday. And today, the mute ones of the past, the inarticulate who took refuge behind wordless intuitions, and the women of today, all action and copies of men, and I in between.
I think we've put it all together now. Mm-hmm. What is so universal about this text, right? Is that she's
lived a life almost that everyone has experienced at some point in their life, because she had such a crazy life that everyone can kind of, I think, identify with some sort of element or some facet to her.
Well, I thought the thing that people could identify with is the rebellion against the social mores and the political things that were holding women back. Mm-hmm. And so she's sort of, it seems like from that quote that there's some sense of exultant liberation in the form of this trapeze act between bigamous marriages and homosexual affairs with June Miller and other individuals, that there's a sense of liberation here.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing that
I'd say even arguably almost like an indebtedness, I would say that she has all these freedoms, so it seems as if that she feels this sort of obligation to speak for the women who in the past haven't been able to sort of fully express themselves either in thought or in speech or in action. But sort of even, not sort of, so not just like our forebears of like generations of women that have been sort of like oppressed before, but even the women who presently feel trapped.
I think we understand now why this might be a feminist text. Like, because I think that was something that I read in the background information. I'm like, well, aside from the sexual liberation here, why is this a feminist thing? But now the way that the quotes that you've used and the way that you've explained it, I get it now. So
cool.
Thank you.
Cool.
You helped me to understand something that I couldn't go and find on my own.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like what Anais says about that sort of like feminine experience of sometimes of sort of feeling very voiceless and sort of want to like kick and scream about something, but you might not have the vocabulary to even sort of like articulate it.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that's where she's kind of like coming from with that angle.
Yeah. CJ, did you want to say? The one thing I thought was sort of interesting is that Henry Miller, he's sort of wrapped up in all this too. I was listening to a interview with him from 1980 when he was like 85 years old, and the talk of his erotica, a lot of people had forgotten that was what he was known for at this particular time. But he actually said that people had taken it too far. That he felt like there was sort of that something needed to be done to introduce that into the literary discourse. But then like he actually was sort of playing, at least in this conversation, he felt like individuals had just taken that and run with it too much. Like that there was more to life than smut. So it was interesting to hear Henry Miller try to like pump the brakes on that in like 1980. He was like, let's slow down here.
Oh.
Yeah, I thought
so he would not approve of like the supermarket romance novels.
I think he probably would have found something trashy about 50
the corset like ripping, like whatever. Romance stuff.
Yeah, it seems like he would probably find something problematic about 50 Shades of Grey or something like that.
Uh-huh.
But I've not read Tropic of Cancer, nor 50 Shades of Grey, so maybe we'll do a comparative study one day
okay.
of those two. I think that was really illuminating. That I think what would be good to talk about right now is how she portrays Henry Miller, because that's what, not only in giving us sort of a feminist perspective on the female condition and sexual liberation and stuff like that, she gives us a portrait of Henry Miller that perhaps other people don't know. Now, Henry Miller himself, in this interview I listened to today from 1980, he said that there was really no distinction between himself and his art, but maybe that is untrue. Sometimes I like to think that there's no distinction between myself and what I put on camera here or record or whatever, but you guys know me off camera, so maybe there's some things that I don't allow for the rest of the world to see. Like, in case anyone cares, I'm a big jerk. Big tyrant.
I would say you're equally obnoxious, like
yes.
on or off camera,
Yes.
so there's that.
Yeah, at least I'm consistent.
Yeah.
So what does she say about Henry Miller? What does she say?
We have this enthusiastic man full of life, curious. He seems to be always full of energy and of joy and just, again, of life.
Yeah, and sort of intoxicated.
Yes,
I think that she
please.
basically said that he's sort of like intoxicated on words.
Mm-hmm.
And he's sort of like in this like drunken stupor of just life. And I mean, I think at one point he was at dinner with sort of a group, and he was just so taken with like the scene of like the wine and the food and the fire, and he just like didn't care. He was like on a different plane, like reveling in the entire experience, like disregarding a very intense conversation.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that keeps coming back. I think that's probably the virtue that we get of Henry Miller, and then maybe indirectly we get, in this, learning a little bit about his wife. There's this scene in the diaries that we're told about where he goes to a movie theater. CJ, can you recapitulate that for us?
Sure. So he goes to a movie theater to spend the night because obviously he's very poor and the theater allows him to sleep.
He watches the same movie 3 times in a row.
Yes, and it's this intoxicating experience if we keep going back to this drug-induced kind of dream state, and it almost seems as if he's on opium. At least that's what he says, right?
Right, he's just like, going to see any sort of movie in a theater, it's like a hit of opium, and then you come out and then you wake up from it, right? Well, he has this unique experience. What happens to him while he's in the movie theater?
Sure, he dreams up of a movie, at least on the screen, of something that seems very autobiographical for
Yes,
him.
yes.
And it's of this woman who, in this...
Well, let's go to this. What happens in the movie?
Sure.
So what's the movie that he's watching?
Sure. The woman in this whole little charade makes up a story of having an affair with a famous actor, and she's trying to get famous. And in this whole story, the actor has to come out to the woman to actually prove that this didn't happen, which in turn plays into her
web of lies.
And her need of fame, and she gets the attention.
Her lies become a truth.
Well, she basically becomes like she becomes like a prophetess because she gives the account of what happened.
Yes.
And he really likes this account, and then they fulfill it.
Right, so he's slipping in and out of consciousness, and he sees parallels between what's being shown in the movie theater with what's going on in his real life. Maybe Jordan can take this. What's going on in his real life?
Oh, I mean, essentially, his wife is kind of a sugar mama.
Well, how does it work? What is he?
They were in New York, and she just said, like, honey, pack your bags. You want to go, right? We're going to send you to Paris. And he was like, cool, with what money? And she's basically like, here. And she's kind of dodgy about money whenever he would kind of, like, question the source. And apparently he would just receive all these like crazy concocted stories that he just gave up asking for like an actual story. So he suspects that there were probably some like less savory ways to acquire said money, but
yeah. What we will learn, Anais will
she funded
him. She will describe June Miller as being the most beautiful woman that she's ever seen, and I'll tell you. In the movie Henry and June, Uma Thurman in 1990 is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen.
Yeah, she
is absolutely gorgeous, and I'm not a big Uma Thurman fan.
I love Uma.
In that movie, anywho, but so she's like, yeah, I'll get you the money, and she probably does some stuff. We'll leave it to the imagination of the audience.
So probably not some savory things.
Right.
But the money appears.
Henry is...
That's all we need to know.
And Henry...
That's all he needs to know.
Right, and Henry shows up in Paris, 40 years old, a failure in America, and he's working on tropical cancer. And he meets Anais Nin. And, okay, we've talked a little bit about this... I mean, what do we learn about the fact that Henry Miller can so poetically describe this slipping in and out of consciousness with this movie? I mean, not only do we learn about him as this colorful figure, this happy, cheerful, monkish, Buddhist kind of character that Anais Nin describes when she first meets him, right? But he's obviously a man who profoundly feels things and draws connections, right? We can see where his genius is with this particular example, right? Now, a little bit more about June Miller. What do we know about Anais's, at least from these diaries, what she says about June Miller? Because I
think your reaction there said it all. Why don't you?
Well, she says right in the diaries that June is this dramatist, that she always puts herself at the center. She spends these elaborate things, that she's not her true self, right? Mm-hmm. That she's like this she desires to be the starlet, and she's not really sort of authentic, and she eventually like tires of her and doesn't really care for her too much because she's like just concerned with trivialities.
She's like squandering the like her own like sort of like natural vitality and like beauty by it's just like, oh my god, she's so breathtakingly beautiful and just like this sort of hypnotic energy, but she's just like the second she opens her mouth, she ruins it. Because she just talks about all these like trivial, like nonsensical things and just creates these little like, just like these little dramas that she's at the center at. And Annie's just like, man, like just ruined. Like she just ruined herself for me.
Well, and she also doesn't like her because she says like because Henry has issues with insecurity, like he lashes out at celebrities when they go to chic places and stuff like that. And June has this ability to dominate Henry in some ways, and she doesn't particularly like how she handles it. But in the movie that's based off of the unexpurgated diaries that Rupert Pohl would later put out, she is not cold and icy towards June Miller. They have in that movie a very, a very steamy affair.
They have some sort of an attraction to each other.
And yeah, Anais is definitely very taken by her at moments. Now, I think ultimately it seems like she has the greatest care for Henry of those characters, but again, that may be Hollywood, and we don't know what's reliable here. Something else that was kind of interesting, we get a little tale about someone that CJ knows a lot about. A little, right? So one day she goes to she goes to Sorbonne because a friend of hers, a dramatist, a poet, an essayist, Antonin Artaud. Yes. Is that how you say his name? He is giving a lecture at the Sorbonne. Who wants to set the stage for that?
Sure.
What happens? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about Artaud's theory of the theater of cruelty.
Sure. So she goes to this lecture, and the lecture is going to be about the plague and theater or something like that. And she goes, and Artaud is giving the lecture, and he expounds about how during the plague, art seemed to be vivid and alive because of this nearness of death that gave some vitality and meaning and drive to the art. And as he's going on about this, suddenly he stops and he starts acting out the plague, or at least of being consumed by the plague.
Les pestes or something, right?
Les pestes,
yes. Les pestes. It sounds worse in French.
As she says.
Right?
And everybody's taken aback at first because this happens out of nowhere. Thinking maybe he's having some sort of seizure or something. But then people catch on and they start chuckling and being, oh my God, is this guy actually doing this? And some of them start leaving. And this goes on for a while until everybody leaves except his friends and Anais, who's sitting there. And he finally gives out the last breath. And then he gets up, goes to Anais. I think he takes her hand. I think he kisses it, and then they go off to a cafe.
He's dejected because they've jeered him, and only his closest friends stayed behind.
Yep. I think he just vents to Anais when he goes out to the cafe to talk to her and say they don't understand what I'm going after.
So
right?
Yeah, what's he trying to do? He says they want to know the how. They want an objective theory of theater, right, but I gave them something more essential.
I gave them the plague.
Yeah. So what is he trying to do with this theater of cruelty? What is essentially like its basic sort of doctrine? I've got a few quotes from Artaud here from Wikipedia that I can.
Sure. Why don't you throw them out first, and then we can.
He's this is from Encyclopedia Britannica, who describes it as a primitive ceremonial experience intended to liberate the human subconscious and reveal man to himself. And then Artaud, I believe himself, said in The Theater and Its Double, called for communion between actor and audience in a magic exorcism, gestures, sounds, unusual scenery, and lighting combined to form a language superior to words that can be used to subvert thought and language. And I lost my space. And to shock the spectator into seeing the baseness of his world. So
shock the spectator to get him out of this world of clicking on Instagram photos, right? Of being
it's not all about
immersed in the world. I don't know, would you compare that, Luke, to maybe just seeing the existential baseness of reality itself?
Or maybe there's something Nietzschean that we can bring into conversation here, right? Because like with Nietzsche, there was that combination between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, and when you stared too much into that existential abyss that was like the suffering of humanity, you pierce the veil of Maya, then you create Apollonian dream images. Maybe Artaud is sort of echoing Nietzschean themes about theater. I don't know enough about Artaud, but it seems now that you mention it and we've done that work together on Birth of Tragedy, I'm sensing some harmony.
Right, but what's interesting though is that he is the surrealist, as Anais Nin says, the surrealist that the surrealists reject, where the surrealists were, as she even mentions in analogizing herself to the surrealists about trying to create this dream state, of living in this dream state. But it seems like Artaud is interested in piercing that veil of Maya, or being in that Apollonian dream world. It almost seems as if he wants to be consumed.
And to bring it sort of back down to earth, I think that, CJ, you mentioned that Artaud was talking about the how. So maybe people want to know the how, but he wants to portray the it.
Yeah. And I think what he's trying to do is to precipitate people to understand death, so maybe that they will go and make more art. I don't know. That's just my conjecture.
No. And what's interesting,
I think that's why he wanted to make him feel the plague.
Yeah.
I mean, why else the plague? I mean, of all the things.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about Artaud is that he also pushed to take theater that people know, take plays that we know, and to remove the text and to leave the gestures and the thematic elements where there's this subservience to the text, maybe a subservience to the dream state that a text maybe gives us, and that maybe he wanted to say, okay, what if we took that away and just left the baseness, left that Dionysian just the well of life is just bubbling and you must stare at it. That is what it's all about. That maybe that is the cruelty of not having that dream state to comfort you. I don't know.
We'll have to. I think we know that we have to. I mean, we're only sort of speculating here. We'd have to look. Unless you know more about Artaud than I do, but I think we would have to go into a deeper study to know for certain. Otherwise, we're kind of conjecturing.
Yeah, I would love to read. I mean, primary source. I only really know him from secondary.
Yeah. Well, I think we should move on to the next thing, right? Which was kind of her insights into psychoanalysis, her relationship with her father, the diary, how all this sort of fits together. She does see a psychiatrist, Dr. Linde. I don't know who this is, but he is very effective at pointing out that the fact that her father abruptly divorced her and, didn't see her for this 20-year span or whatever caused her to become a very independent person who was repulsed by cruelty, but then at the same time sort of taking refuge in this diary. But she felt like he didn't really understand the artist mentality, and so that's why she sought out Otto Rank. And Otto Rank, like I mentioned earlier, was a disciple of Freud who broke because he had this thing called will therapy. I'll just say this. And in general, this idea, Rank in 1929 said this, the neurotic lives too much in the past. And to that extent, he actually does not live. He suffers because he clings to the past, wants to cling to it in order to protect himself from experience, the emotional surrender to the present. And I think the idea here is that individuals who don't fully sort of channel their... I have no authority on Otto Rank here, but just the brief thing that I can get from this is that neurosis and depression, stuff like that, is like when we're not sort of properly channeling our essence, our being, our genius, or whatever. We're hung up on things. And I think what Otto is trying to say, and maybe I'm saying a little too much here, what is Otto trying to say about the diary, Jordan, and Anais's relationship with it? Because she's always writing in this journal. Henry Miller says, put that in your journal.
It's almost like a dependent relationship.
Yeah, go on. Can you elaborate on this some more?
I mean, because the diary, became sort of this... I almost want to say like an entity almost, in a way. I mean, she started at the age of 11 and, it just became like a friend to her and like a companion. And I think in which that she could kind of like sort of try to reconcile these split selves.
Can you talk to these split selves? Because she felt like she was saying her truth in that diary, but she thought that she had to be other people and other dynamics.
And I think a lot of that has to do a little bit with her father. And I think it's really interesting because she tried so hard, like sort of like not to really become her father, but she was just like, I just sort of inherited this sort of inherent falsehood. And she's just like, man, I always feel like I'm sort of changing like masks out with
her father people. Was very interested in the sensuous life, and maybe that wasn't really who Anais was.
I mean, I don't even think it was just that aspect. I think it was just kind of like he was a very deceitful person, and that sort of, I think that she kind of like was like, oh my god, this is like genetic. Like I I'm just not a very sincere person. And that concerns her. I mean, she kind of mentions that throughout the text, but I think that it's kind of like, at least her diary is kind of like where she can kind of like hang her hat a little bit and just be like, phew, I can like put my sweatpants on and like chill out emotionally.
But I mean, she's not just emoting in her diary. She's saying very profound things, right?
Yeah.
She's having like very profound.
But I mean, what's not to say you can't have sort of profound insights while emoting?
No, she is. She's doing both. But I mean, it's
it's not just dear diary. Like it's not like fell in love with Johnny today. Like it's not like just that.
Well, yeah. There's more. I think it's a combination, obviously, because she has strong emotions about the house, but then she also has like she puts forward some theories of psychoanalysis and even some philosophical stuff, and that makes it worth reading in and of itself.
Right.
But
because she only published about like half of the diary contents.
Right. And so, what does Otto say about this diary?
That she basically needs to, in order if she wants to like fully move on, she basically kind of has to almost like cut ties with the diary.
Right. You mean move on as in like I think it was write a novel or something like that.
Right, exactly. Like put that drive to sort of put pen to paper into like I guess like a less private, mode of communication.
Yeah, your literature, your literary career.
Yeah.
Because she had these. She felt like there were many books and novels within her that this diary was pretty much holding her up from writing.
Right.
And so eventually she says that Otto helped her be reborn and synthesize all these different splintered cells that result of the abandonment and everything else, all the different identities that she had to sort of traffic in. So I think we've said a lot of good stuff here. I think we were talking off camera earlier. I thought there was one really big point that we hadn't really gotten a chance to discuss, and maybe there's some other things you guys want to talk about. But trying to understand this, not only were we talking about what might be universal to the female perspective, we get this sort of idea of liberation and how that is sort of a response to social and political mores. But something you were saying about what it's like to be a woman who has creative genius.
Oh yeah.
Would you mind speaking to that?
Sure. I mean, this was like I think in like the last hour or the sort of like I don't know, like almost an hour into the audiobook. And there's this one quotation really that resonated with me. And she said, "Psychoanalysis did save me because it allowed the birth of the real me, a painful one for a woman. Filled with dangers, for no one has ever loved an adventurous woman as they have loved an adventurous man."
And what do you like about that quote?
I don't know. I think what it just speaks to, I mean, just I think this is an experience just universal for everyone, right? I mean, sort of like coming into your own existentially. I mean, it reminded me a lot of Simone de Beauvoir. But a little bit more of the actual terror in it, in the pains, right? Because Simone de Beauvoir says, well, you have to reach this point of crisis when your metaphysical privilege wears off and you realize, oh my God, my actions actually have bearing on the world and they have like real consequences. Holy shit. So she, Simone alludes to that, but I think that Nin really sort of articulates that agony really well.
Yeah. Well,
it's sort of midwifing the generative power of the mind and like that creativity, which I think can take place simultaneously with the physical generative power that women have, but it's this, I think, this like balance, but I think it's also like a testament of the times too.
Yeah.
Because to be an adventurous woman in that period was, practically probably like social suicide. I mean, and I think a lot of the erotica that she wrote was in the 40s. So to have that published in the 40s, I mean, I'm pretty sure like censors would have just buried her alive, and her works would like never see the light of day. So you really have to keep context in mind.
I don't know. There is some dispute about when she actually was able to find a publisher because of the erotica, because it was so adventurous. I'm not exactly sure, unless you know something.
I think I read The Guardian has a really cool article on Anais Nin and sort of comparing Lena Dunham, and I think that she, the author of this article, said that she wrote the stuff in the 40s.
Yeah, no, writing it definitely. I think the question for all of them is if they were able to find a distributor. That's a wonkish thing to take up another time. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I think we covered a lot of terrain. I think we did a good job.
There's so much. Yeah, I mean, we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, hopefully, I think what we've done here is we'll turn on a lot of people to her work. And they'll go investigate it. And now we can go deeper into Henry Miller, to Otto Rank, to Artaud. This opens up new worlds to me, new people that I've never taught, studied. Mm-hmm. So hopefully other people will have the same experience. Would you guys like to say anything in closing?
I think I just want to emphasize again the form of a diary, which I think is really cool and something that we haven't really done yet. Yeah. I don't know if you all can speak to it, but I think everything that you touched on with this idea of finding this universal woman, or of this sort of Bildungsroman, sort of just like coming of age sort of story, that she's just writing this just of her own experience, and yet we find some sort of universal appeal, or at least we say, oh, that resonates with me, because partly because it happened, right? It's nonfiction. Mm-hmm. We're not dealing with a fictional character. This is Anais, nonfiction, but then the way she twists things, and we have these florid descriptions, and who knows if Henry Miller actually said the things that he did, even though she is rather good with memory. We're pretty sure maybe if she's sitting there thinking of what Henry Miller said,
it's definitely colored by her own reality.
Right. So we have this idea of fiction and nonfiction sort of meshing together.
It's not an objective history text.
No, exactly. And that's what makes this form so fascinating, at least of a diary, or even of a memoir, is that it is sort of like a philosophical treatise in a different way, because we get an existential experience of one human being, and yet, even though we can't necessarily, I can't go into Jordan's mind and see what she's doing, just as me just sitting here, I can read her diary, or I can read, if I can't get into Anais's mind, but I can read her diary and get into her mind somehow. And that sort of exchange, I think, especially with a nonfiction, not quote-unquote nonfiction, or I don't know, like a lyric essay, is quite fascinating and very exhilarating.
It's very it's simultaneously true and untrue on a level, right?
Yeah. Which is life, which is art.
But she's not lying about anything. Yeah, she's not lying, absolutely. But there's an untruth.
But who knows if she is?
There's subjectivity in it.
I think that there's an interview that she did with Studs Terkel in the 70s.
Oh, tell us about it.
And so for her, she talks to him about how sort of like dream and legend and myth and reality are sort of fused for her.
Oh,
and so
more.
She mentions that she kind of sort of paraphrases Baudelaire and says that every person has a man, woman, and child sort of contained within them, and that artists still have that childlikeness to them, and that child doesn't die, and they sort of go on making these sort of like fantasies and these sort of fantastical creations. But she credits the artist with maintaining that childlike, fantastic.
I would agree. I would say
element.
I'd say that we do
and
that
I think,
here.
And I definitely think that to CJ's point of sort of that mixture, right, of sort of fiction and nonfiction, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of Pliny's letters, because he wrote letters, but he published them. So there's that, and he edited them, and that's the same thing with the Adams papers with John and Abigail Adams, because she knew that Abigail Adams knew that all of her letters were going to be read, so she took like very meticulous pains to write these like beautiful like letters, and there's that really wonderful tension between artifice and just being genuine in your writing. With like these sort of like very intimate.
I wonder if someone has philosophically reflected on the diary.
Funny you mentioned that. There's a wonderful little manifesto by a man named David Shields called Reality Hunger, and it deals with this idea of blending fiction and nonfiction, and I'm not giving it a service, but it is about trying to take the nonfiction, like an essay or of all these different forms, and trying to blend it with fiction, and that is life. And like documentaries sometimes aren't exactly always like journalism, and that there's always these different elements going on at the same time, and people steal quotes from here and there and do that, and it's almost this rallying cry for a form of art in many different fields that calls to this thing that like we're getting with Anais and that we're getting with the Adams letters, that there's that to experience life is this fiction, non-fiction sort of thing, that we have artifice and we have reality, or we have quote unquote truth, and that is our reality, and we're like striving for that. Like I don't want Anais to put her diary in the form of like, I don't know, a book, like, where it's just like, and her character's name is like Cynthia, and Cynthia's going off and meets Tom and July Miller, and like they mix up the names. Like, just give me what you actually experienced, but mix it up with artifice.
Yeah.
But his name is David Shields, Reality Hunger, if anybody's interested.
Cool.
Sorry.
Well, I think we did it justice. I'd have to say, I really enjoyed this ensemble effort. Cool. Very good stuff. Very good stuff. All right, thank you for listening, everyone. We'll have this up on the Noetic app very shortly. We have some very big updates coming down the line. Ooh, intrigue. Stay tuned. Download the Noetic app as it is, and take care.